welcome.
Hey.
All right. Perfect. Please volunteer. Come join the booth. You get in for the state fair for free. It's apparently a lot of fun. I know I'm volunteering on the first day of the state fair, and I'm all by myself in my time up slot, so you could join me. And then our next meeting in September is Diana Dickinson.
It's not just crushing strains, methods that aren't using extraction.
Awesome. It's other ways to extract honey without an extractor.
Yep.
It should be awesome. And we're actually going to be downstairs and using the kitchen.
So we can taste.
Yeah. So it'll be kind of fun. Announcements. We need board members. So even if you yourself don't feel prepared to be a board member yet, maybe you can think of someone to be a board member. We need a public affairs person. We need a new education person. The board is fun. Come join us. Then we also, this is my reminder that this is your club. So please volunteer for things. Come to events, like give us ideas. Know what you're up to. Sometimes it feels like just board members are volunteering and we already know each other. So come volunteer for things. Come talk bees. And then the last little blurb I have is, this is extractor time. A lot of people have been hitting me up. You email me, the vice president. The email is easy, vice-president@portlandurbanbeekeepers.org. It's also on the website. I have the electric extractor. So you have to have taken the class to check it out. There is a manual extractor that Jackie has, and I can give you her number. If you email me, I'll just send you her number so you can check that one out. This is all the info about our learning apiary. It's 10 to 12. And then with no further ado, tonight we have Dr. Andony Melathopolos, and you're an associate professor at OSU focused on the health of native and managed bees and working in natural landscapes. His research spans pesticide applicators, understand pollinator risk on product labels, the real world exposure created by pesticide use practices, and the pollination value of managed bees and crops like blueberry. In 2017, Andony partnered with the Oregon State Arthropod Collection to launch the Oregon Bee Atlas and Master Melatologist Program, the first extensive certification of its kind. And it's a really cool program. I've learned a tiny bit about it. It's just really awesome. So check out the OSU website about it. And basically it's a volunteer-driven native bee inventory of the United States. Andony collaborates across disciplines to expand nectar and pollen resources for bees and working landscapes while mentoring undergraduate and graduate researchers throughout his program. So welcome. And I will attempt to switch over here. It's going to be easy.
Pollen Thieves. So spelt incorrectly, the university professor is apt to do. But what it's the old British thieves. Thank you. What I did want to talk about this evening is the interaction between bees and plants, but I wanted to give it at a different level. We all have heard this story. Bees and plants, flowering plants, are mutually interrelated. It's a lovely story, but there's more going on there. And by knowing this, it'll explain what you're seeing on your plants. And I know Diane has given me a big box of pollen with her pollen traps. We'll talk a little bit about pollen traps at the end. You know this story. Honeybees are the best pollinators, or bees in general, best pollinators, because they are not only, when they're going into this mustard flower, dislodging the pollen, but they're actually collecting it to bring back to the brood nest. That means that they're really motivated to go after pollen. Now, pollen is, as you all know, a protein source. If we look at clovers, and all the clovers are pretty much dried up, if you look, you open one of those florets up, there's a little keel that has both the male and female parts, very much like on that mustard flower we saw, that every time a bee goes in, it gets hit under the chin, it dabs it with pollen, but also picks up some pollen on the stigma and sets a fruit. The pollen that's being hit under their chin is, of course, you all know this, right? Source of protein, it's a source of lipids, also minerals, and it is essential for rearing brood. The close ancestors of bees did not use pollen. So this is a big shift in this big branch of life in the wasps. If you look at pollen, everybody's seen these spiky pictures of pollen under an electron micrograph. It doesn't give you the full picture. What they've essentially done is taken off the outer fatty coat. That's the spiky part. But if we look at the pollen, there's this part on the outside. It can often be relatively thick that they have to wash off with acid to be able to see that spiky coat or that different sized coat. It's called the pollen kit. It's a weird word. It's not pollen. It's not pollen kit. It's pollen KITT. I don't know why, but so it is. And that is really attractive to your bees. There are all sorts of things that are sequestered in that fatty layer that's attractive to bees, but can also be distasteful to bees. It's also the primary source of lipids.
What is a lipid?
Oh, sorry. Thank you. A lipid is a fat. So the fats, the bees, they need fats. It's coming primarily from that outer sticky coat. Inside is the meat. It's kind of like all the pollen tube. It'll come out of these little holes at some point when its conditions are right. It'll go through these little pores. It'll germinate on the stigma and extend all the way down to the ovule. The bees want to get that out, but it's protected by this hard, indigestible thing called an exine. It is super tough. It's the thing that you see in the images that looks like a space alien ship. That's the exine. Bees, it was not easy in evolutionary history to get this stuff out of there. It's really locked away. The plant has really created a mechanism for it to come out only when it wants it to. And so part of the evolution of this whole story is bees being able to literally crack that nut. How's the sound out there, folks? You hearing me okay?
Yes.
Zoom land? Okay. Okay. Bees are actually nothing special. Like if you look at the evolutionary history of where they're situated, if you didn't know this, the bees, wasps, and ants are all in one group. And the bees are a real sliver. And they're not even like a real high level. They're just this like sliver that came off this branch of life of the wasps. At the root of this family tree, at the very bottom of it, are things like sawflies. Have anybody seen a sawfly? They can sometimes be quite big. They're a pest of forestry. These are the primeval wasps. And the thing you notice about it, you can see its abdomen, not constricted. It just goes straight into the body. Like it doesn't have any kind of constriction like a wasp or an ant, like a typical wasp or ant does. What this graph shows you is like millions of years along the bottom. And you can't see it, but I can. Those little dots start off yellow. It means primary diet was some kind of vegetable matter. And if you know anything about sawflies, they're forestry pests. They're caterpillars like eat needles of plants or eat your plants. Then quickly in the evolutionary history, it all turns red. They start to depend entirely, the whole group, on animal protein, typically other insects. So most wasps get their protein to make their young not from the pollen, but from, or any kind of plant matter, but by eating other insects. Then and your hot dog, hamburger. Then there's this strange reversion that takes place. Somewhere they revert to becoming vegetarians again. They go back to this earlier lifestyle and the protein is coming from pollen. I want to get into this story tonight because it's really cool. I also want to point out there's another strange lineage right up here. The Masserine wasps. this little group up here. You'll find them around Oregon. They're beautiful. They look like yellow jackets. They're closely related, but they also have gone back to digesting pollen. We have them all around the state. And funnily enough, you know how they say your colony needs a wider range of pollen species to be healthy? You know, you want a diversity of pollen diets. These either go to penstemons or Phacelia scorpion weed. You'll never find them on any other plant. We have 3 species in the state. There has been some detections in southern Willamette Valley, but they're really widely distributed east of the state and really crazy, but not a lot of species. 3 species, and we have like 800 species of bees and only 3 species of pollen wasps. Not a great successful attempt at the pollen lifestyle, but nevertheless. Let's go back to where this all started, in the beginning. And to get at the beginning, I was on a trip this time of year. I went to Norway, and I love Norway. Beautiful honeybees, super short season, but they really make the most of their season. So you go through the public gardens and they look like this. Big, amazing statue, wonderful display, just goes on forever. As I wandered through Oslo, I came to the Royal Botanical Museum, which great place to wander into. And if you go to the center, they have this great garden. The garden is they've arranged all the plants according to their relationship. And the thing, if you know anything, is anybody a botanist in this room? Out there? They're always changing things. So they say, oh, this plant's over here, and then they change their mind. So the poor gardener has to rip the stuff out and replant them over there. It's just like, it's this thing. But it's a systematic garden, and so everything is planted according to how they're related. It's really great because you can walk along and say, I never knew that a manzanita and a blueberry are in the same family. Makes sense. Yeah.
Just say, you can say it's not being sicky.
It's obvious. Well, here's another one. You know, camas and camas and grass. They're all monocots, like maybe less obvious, but you would see them kind of planted together and it kind of pulls out this pattern. The story of pollen in this history of life doesn't start from the beginning. As you all know, we're in the Pacific Northwest. We have ferns, we have horsetails, all sorts of plants with vascular plants that don't make pollen. They reproduce in a totally different way. It started with the conifers. And so here, it happened at a time in the planet when things got really dry. And the thing about ferns is for reproduction to take place, there needs to be moisture for pollen for the equivalent of what they have for transfer. Pollen doesn't need moisture. As you know, when your conifers set all this pollen off, it just floats through the air and it's super durable. And if it's hot and dry, it doesn't matter. As long as it hits the cone, it will germinate and create a seed. So this started before the flowering plants that our bees visit. And of course, honeybees will pick up pollen from conifers. And there's been great studies looking at the protein content in pollen from conifers, and it's terrible. It's like eating Twinkies or something, or maybe less than a Twinkie, a Wassa cracker. But lo and behold, critters figured this out and started to eat the stuff. And so now the earliest pollen eaters, pollen thieves, were beetles. Some beetles started, and they still do. Here's from the mid-Cretaceous, a fossil. This beetle has in its gut all of these pollen grains from a cycad, which is also not a flowering plant. It's from an older group of plants. So insects started to eat pollen, and they weren't very good at it. They don't eat it. They don't digest it really well. It's haphazard. They get something out of it. It's not great. The other thing is these beetles are just kind of like coming across the pollen, and they're not being trained by the plant. The arms race between flowering plants and bees that comes later hasn't really started. There are no really rewards. There's no color. They're not attracted to things. You could say, in a way, beetles are dumb pollinators. And they're not really even pollinators because they're just eating. And they're not being trained. The plant is kind of like, I wish these things would go away, but what can I do about them? It's not what comes later. So let's set the stage. What does it look like when this all starts off? There are wasps already. There are all sorts of wasps that have evolved. And you have a world that looks like this. This is Brazil around the time of the evolution of the bees. There are some flowering plants. The magnolias have already come up. There's like primitive plants, flowering plants. If you ever look at a magnolia when it opens up, it has a very simple flower. But it really isn't the color that you see in your garden in the spring. It's a much more bland world. This is when bees evolve. So there's already the beginnings of flowering plants. And I want you to see what happens. So here's the world before bees, and here are the plants. Look what happens at the same time as the origin of bees. A gazillion major plant groups come about. And it's likely coming about because of this interaction between the bees and these plants. They happen coincidentally. And you can see sorry folks on Zoom, but at the very bottom of the graph, where what was there before are things like conifers that are wind pollinated. They have dumb beetles coming to them and eating the pollen and get away from me. And what comes later is all the color. And this is being driven by this amazing evolutionary interaction between bees and flowers. Let's look at those any questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do they date it? How do they know if this change took place?
There's a couple ways they know this. So the first way, the old way, is fossils. And so you would try to figure out what's the age of the rock, and then you'd see the fossil, and then you kind of rough age of where it was located. Now what they do is they kind of know when certain markers have evolved, and if you can get some DNA out of them, you can look at its ancestors, you make an array, and you can figure out like roughly when it evolved, but by gene changes. So there's two ways they do it. By their DNA, but really the best evidence is you have it in a rock, the age of that rock, it's that old.
And so these insects are fossilized? Is that how you know that they're there?
We have fossilized insects. Not a lot of them, but we do.
Interesting.
Amber.
Amber is a really great way that insects are fossilized. They get caught in the amber. That beetle was caught in amber.
That's a sap.
It's a sap, and then the rock hits down, and you can sort of date it that way. If you go to the base of this thing, the very base of the flowering plants the group that includes the magnolias are called the magnoliids. And if you look at them, there they are. There's the family tree of the flowering plants that have like flowers. So we're not talking about evergreens anymore. We're talking about flowering plants. Water lilies and magnolias are some of the most, they are plants that haven't changed all the way back to when these flowering plants started to pop out. There's a nice study. I want to get to this topic of dumb and smart pollinators. You can look this up and read it one day. Nectar secretion and nectaries in basal angiosperms. So nectar in these really ancient plants, which still exist. You still have magnolia and non-core eudicots. The excerpt from this is if you look at a magnolia, it really doesn't have a specialized nectary. Those very first plants still haven't benefited from this interaction with the bees, and their nectaries are really primitive. They're not, as you see, differentiated nectaries. They're just kind of like little slits where sap is coming out of the flower. It's the first way we have honey, pub honey in the room. Sorry, folks, if you came here in person, you could have qualified for the silent auction and had pub honey. That is the very first source of this honey was just like juice coming out of the flower. and not a very specialized organ. I have a lot of family trees. Here you can see a ginkgo. A ginkgo is not yet a flowering plant, and it apparently has these things where it's exuding some of this sugar. But as you go down to more complicated plants, like a bean, like a vetch, they have real special nectaries. They're hiding these things away. They're putting them up in the flower so that the bee has to crawl it in there, really do the pollination. There's becomes an arms race, and you can see it. The base, the flowers really don't deal with nectar in a sophisticated way, but by the time you get to a sunflower, they're putting where the nectar comes out in a very precise location. So there's our ginkgo with just a little bit of fluid welling up. Very basic. This gets way more complicated. And there's our magnolia. And the magnolia, if you looked at the nectary, and the tulip tree is also in this group as well, it's basically a modified leaf with just a kind of little bit of a slit coming out. It's kind of like dropping out the nectar and insects are coming to it, but it's not really directing and training these bees as they're evolving over history. So as you go down here, the nectaries are really being used to train these new smart pollinators that are evolving, that you all keep in your hives. This is a race that's taking place, and it's been ratcheting up for millions of years, and there's been all sorts of innovation and changes, and that's why we have so many crazy plants that you can go to Portland Nursery and buy. Okay, before we go to the smart pollinators, are there any questions? Yes.
I hate to be so stupid, but what's a nectary?
Yes. No, it's a good question because your bees go into the flower and they have
the flower.
They have a tongue, right? And they're they're getting nectar to make the honey, right? But where is it coming from? It started off like if you look at that tulip tree, which is very primitive, it's just kind of like somewhere in the flower, there's a bit of a slit and sugar from the flower is coming out and kind of wells up, just like a garden hose with a little razor slit in it. And it's like, oh, geez, how did that happen? It gets more complicated. Some of these are specialized organs that are really put deep in the flower so that the bee has to go through a kind of maze to find it. In the process, the flower's got the bee where it wants it.
So the nectary isn't any part of the plant reproducing. Is that correct?
It's part of the flower, but it's a special organ that exudes sugar. And it's trying to get the bee in a vice grip so that it can put its pollen in a place where the bee can't get it off and eat it. That's what a nectary is trying to do. And I'll show you with some of the more complicated flowers. How many of you have ever seen a honeybee on a lavender with pollen? It's got pollen, for heaven's sakes. What's going on here? It's like something like a lavender is metering out the pollen so finely that the bee can't ever get it. It's doing pollination every time it hits one of those flowers, but you're never going to see a corbicula full of lavender pollen. Never. Okay. Let's talk about the smart bee. So you can see here, if you look at the flowering plants and the number of them on the planet today, these basil, like the magnolias, see the bars are very low. There's not many of them on the planet. The group that took off called the eudicots, which are the more evolved flowering plants, these shot up. These compose most of the species diversity of flowering plants on the planet, and they have these ones that came forward to do real well. That kind of hiding things away and kind of playing this game with bees led to rapid diversification of flowering plants on Earth. And so we have the monocots come off next. So there we have our camas, our calochortus lilies are in that group. The next group to evolve are the eudicots. That includes our poppies. And we were just talking about how hilarious it is to watch a bee do donuts in the cup on a California poppy. They go round and round gathering pollen. Buttercups are in this group. So these are still quite primitive flowers. And you can see it. It's just a cup with some things in the middle of it. But look what happens later. The fabids, which include our willows, our bean plants. These are weird looking flowers. They're not a cup with just some things sticking out of them. They look weird. And a bee's starting to have to really swirl its way in to get things. The malvids, which include our mustards, farewell to spring, which is just stopped blooming, or clarkias, Sedelcia, or checker mallows, the lamids, which I think honeybees must have evolved with the family, which has the lavender, which has the Russian sage, which has the, every plant, that top plant on a list for bees is in the mint family. And then finally, the last group to come off are the sunflowers. They're the most complex and complicated flowers there are. And they are the sort of the last stage of this ever-going historical evolutionary thing that's going on. Now, I want to point this out because all of this happens, but where did the bees come from? If like these flowering plants came from these conifers that were spitting gobs of indiscriminate pollen across the landscape, where did the bees come from? Here's their closest ancestors. They're really closely related. Some of them don't have a lot of species. Cabrandae are super, like the sand wasps. They look and they act like bees. But instead, you all know this maybe. Honeybees are weird. They live in a hive. Most of our bees, 70% of the species live in the ground somewhere. They have a little hole, they make a little divot, they collect some pollen, they make a pollen ball, they lay an egg on it. That's how most of the bees do it. There's no nurse bees or anything. It's like a single individual doing this. This is what these guys were doing, except for stuffing pollen down the hole. They would drag something like this down the hole. They paralyze something, they put it down the hole, they lay an egg on it. All that bees did, there was like a little shift. Instead of that, they put a ball of pollen down there. This is the big shift that took place, but you can see it's not a big shift because they're still kind of like doing the same things, kinda. In fact, the closest relative of the bees are these, they're called, they're parasitic wasps of flower thrips. You know flower thrips? You've got your dahlia out and they just shred. So these guys are parasites of them. So they lay eggs on them. They gather them up, actually. They gather the flower thrips up and they put it down a hole and they lay an egg on them. But in the process, it's thought that they kind of like swim pollen all the time because they're hunting these flower thrips. And somehow they're just like, their ancestors started to develop the ability to digest this pollen, and then that ancestors never went back. They forgot the thrips and they just started eating the pollen. That's where bees likely came from. It's crazy. Just happenstance. It's kind of like, remember the old ad? Where did the Reese's peanut butter cup come from? Somebody put their chocolate bar in somebody's peanut butter thing and dipped it up. It's kind of like that. Like bees didn't come out of some holy, peaceful thing. They came out of like this strange evolutionary pathway that nobody could have anticipated.
So bees came from wasps.
Yeah.
So what? It's another dumb question.
No, it's a great question.
Yeah.
You've had great ones so far. We'll see. See how you do.
What is the difference between a wasp and a bee?
If you talk to a person who is looks at evolutionary patterns, they'll say there's not that much different between them. There's this little kooky lifestyle change that takes place, but really they're wasps. But the implication of this lifestyle change changes the evolution of plants forever. So it's like a very small change in the wasps where they kind of go from eating little thrips to eating pollen. but this has an impact on the plants. The plants are like now, okay, well, we got these nectaries, we're going to hide these things. And this pollen, maybe they're going to deliver it to the plant we want it to go to, so we don't have to make so much pollen. All sorts of things get set off. There's a cascade of evolutionary processes that just start to bubble up at this point. So they're, in some sense, just a wasp, but in another sense, they're no wasp. Charlie.
So is the biology and anatomy of the wasp and the bee very similar?
Oh yeah, like those sand wasps, they same thing. There's all sorts of morphology that's almost the same.
So it's the diet that distinguishes a bee from the wasp. Is that kind of how
It's a diet, but then their behavior starts to change because these guys are hunting wasps, so they're little thrips, and they have a little thrip brain, hunting brain. Bees develop this brain for finding these flower patches here, there, and everywhere. Like it changes a lot, and then they've got to like, well, how are we going to carry this pollen home? So they develop these weird legs that they got to pack pollen on, and then there's like, well, we got to get this nectar. And suddenly these little tiny wasp tongues become these extraordinary long things that can reach to the back of a delphinium.
So that's a wasp.
So that's a wasp. A weird wasp. A vegetarian wasp. How's that? Okay. The first bees, actually, to get to Charlie's question, are a little bit, they kind of have a wasp-like characters, but they start to develop, like they do have branched hairs, which is one way that you can tell a bee from a wasp. The hairs go from simple hairs to hairs that are sort of designed to trap pollen. So that this is 100 million years ago, they've got a fossil that's kind of like half wasp, half bee looking. It has kind of mixed characters. But things really get going with these plants. So is it, bees visiting flowers? And of course, when you're speaking to the public, and it's so great that you're a member of and you're spokespeople to the world about bees, bees love flowers. Keep telling them that. That's totally fine. But is it a war? Like, these flowers are, they're trying to be careful with their pollen, and they don't want these bees just to take it away. Or is it kind of like a truce? Because we've been through this. They take the pollen and they don't just drop it on the stigma, they eat it. It reminds me of, if you remember The Good, Bad, and the Ugly. So Clint Eastwood's character is like, they're trying to find this. Anybody remember this movie? Yeah, the Civil War, the Confederate treasure. They can't cooperate because they're kind of like, what the ugly is like totally opportunistic, and the bad will sell the mother for whatever. And Clint Eastwood's kind of noble but wily, but together they'll all have to work together to kind of make it happen. And the same thing happens with bees and flowers. Here's a little diagram of like how the world can work. From a plant's perspective, a good bee would be one that removes very little pollen and deposits a lot of pollen. That would be a perfect bee. Like, lavender probably has perfected this. They give up very little pollen and they get complete pollination because the bees keep going to the lavender over and over and over again. They cracked it. An ugly situation is where the bee removes a lot of pollen and never deposits any of it. That would be totally ugly from a plant's perspective. And so there are pressures to avoid this. I'm going to show you some uglies. So the trick is not giving the farm away. Can I give them just enough pollen and nectar to kind of do the job without them like stripping it bare, and I've got to photosynthesize for 3 days to replace stuff? There is this great paper. They went through and they looked at the pollen requirements for different bees and different plants. How many bees could a flower produce? So the need for pollen by bees is in this graph here, which you can't see, but it's how many plants for a single brood cell are required for these plant species. And you'll see here, there's the flower and there's the bee, and here are the estimates. And it shows, oh, we'll take the middle part out because it's not important for this. This plant here, this is Hoplites tridentata. It's a mason bee. And on lotus, which is a trefoil, one brood cell takes 289 flowers, which is the equivalent of 11 plants. There's a lot of flowers that have to be visited to make one brood cell. So it's clearly not trefoil, which we have in every ditch, does not give its pollen up willingly. In contrast, you can see here, this is a sweat bee, and 75 flowers for one brood cell, so 0.1 plants. It's a lot easier for it to get it out of this alfalfa plant. If you look at how the pollen is being rationed, this study is really great. It shows a number of different plants along the bottom and where the pollen is in the plant. The first part, the gray, is the pollen that's been lost. It's just kind of like off the table, it's gone when they did the study. But the gray one is the hidden pollen, and the darker gray one is the exposed and available pollen. And you can see the first one is a buttercup, and there's a lot of exposed pollen. That gray bar at the bottom is quite big. In comparison to a stachy, which is a hedge nettle, but also the other common one is the hyssop. They're stackies. No, they're hyssops. They're not related. So a stachy, but you can see here as well, globe thistle is right beside it. But you can see it holds a lot of pollen that it never releases. It only meters out a small sliver of pollen. This explains why some plants, like poppy, a bee goes in and comes packed with pollen. It's a game. Okay, I'm going to put a lot of pollen out there. I'm going to attract a lot of bees. I'm going to roll my dice. These plants here are really, I imagine a lavender would be in the same boat, is giving out pollen very tightly. What's going on here is the flower is trying to encourage good behavior from the bee. It's repeat visitation, very economical. And so I think I've shown people this before. You can see one way this works is that the bees start to specialize on the pollen of one plant. The plant becomes tightly associated. So if you walk around the neighborhood, you'll find black-eyed Susan and Russian sage side by side. And if you look at the bees, they're entirely different. Your honeybees will largely not be on the cone flower, but Russian sage. And so here you can see there's a sunflower bee here at the top with first Rudbeckia, sweat bee, and a small carpenter bee. But if you look at the Russian sage, even though these plants are side by side, honeybee, leaf cutting bee, and a bumblebee. Part of this has to do with the shape of the flower. These are long, narrow flowers, and some of the bees have very long tongues. Honeybees are considered a bee with a pretty long tongue. But this one here is not the case. This bee has a long tongue, but doesn't go to the Russian sage. The reason is it has specialized on toxic compounds that the asters are putting into the pollen. This pollen specialization, so some bees, like honeybees and bumblebees, have evolved to digest a lot of different pollen. And they're not really good at it, but they do a good job. And that's why your honeybees need a variety of different pollen sources. Sometimes they're hitting something that's a little bit toxic, but they blend it down. And so in the end, it works out. We call that polylectic, but there's bees that specialize. They only digest pollen from one family of plants, which we call oligolecti, or one genus of plants, which we call narrow oligolecti. This beautiful bee here, you'll find out in Eastern Oregon, bees in the genus Diadasia. They have really specialized. If you look at a cactus, an Opuntia cactus, the pollen grains are massive. you can almost like see the pollen grain on the bee. They've really evolved to collect pollen from big flowers with big pollen grains. And so you only find them either on these Opuntia cactuses, or if we look at the family tree, you find them on mallows. Now, these two plants aren't related. These are cactus Diadasia bees, and these all these species of bees here are going to checker mallows. The thing is all of these plant species have huge pollen grains, and so these bees have really evolved. A honeybee would just like, it'd be like carrying marbles. Just like, whoa. They're really good at catching this stuff. They've got these dense hairs that are well spaced, and so they can really get all this stuff. Just ending now, if you went up to Mount Hood Meadow, we have these Calochortus lilies. This bee is only ever found on this Calochortus lily. Seriously, the whole hillside covers with these flowers. This bee is impossible to find in the state unless you go there. Part of this has to do with that sticky, attractive coat. There's stuff stuck in that sticky, attractive coat that is not only attractive, but distasteful and colorful. Here's a bluebell from the northeast of the US. At higher elevation, the pollen grains are darker. And it turns out there's one bee, this campanula, Megachile campanulae, when presented with these two flowers, only goes to the darker one. You can see it in the graph here. It is attracted to the colors that's in that outer pollen kit, that fatty layer. So it can see the pollen. Of course, we all know this because you've all seen a guide like this, right? The pollen colors of the bees. This is Dorothy Hodges. She was a beekeeper she went to Goldsmith University at Art College, and she came up with she has these beautiful, this is the first edition that's been reproduced, and she did these beautiful oil colors of the color of the pollen. So that color of the pollen is in the pollen kit, and that color is often attractive to bees, so it's used as an attractant. I want to point out, and you can see that here, if you look at different pollen grains, and it's hard to see in this slide, but things like blackberry or green, and things in the sunflower or family are typically a yellow orange, and so on and so forth. I do want to just emphasize that pollen kit is also super attractive. There's more than just pigments, and I'm going to talk about poisons in a second. But this simple example when you put pollen in a pollen patty. So if you have a pollen patty and you just use the dust, the soy and the yeast, some of you who are newer beekeepers may not know this, but you put this patty down and they want to eat. If you put a percentage of pollen in there, they'll eat it like crazy. The reason for this is there's chemicals in that fatty outer layer that are super attractive. I tested this out many years ago where I had just a soy flower patty and then I had 10% pollen or 40% pollen. Don't worry about the chocolate chip hypothesis or any of that, but you can see in 10 days, a 13-gram patty is 13 days, 80 grams of pollen are consumed with 40% pollen, about 50 with 10%, and barely 10 grams of that patty are eaten if there's no pollen. The pollen is super attractive to bees to eat. But they put other stuff in there too. Death camas, right? So death camas, looks like camas. It's white. From a bulb, you can't tell the difference. So First Nations around this region kind of knew areas where death camas wasn't in the bed. And bees in that pollen coat, death camas puts alkaloid chemicals in that fatty layer that can kill bees. If you look at this study here, this is with mason bees, and they just put little bits of it in, and this is the percent of the larva dying that died. You just have to put a little bit of it into the diet of the bee, and it's dead. This bee here can forage on death chemists till the cows come home. It has evolved the capacity to digest the pollen. Any questions?
Good.
How would the plant want to kill the bee if it's pollinating it?
It's kind of like, I think that it's kind of like complicated. Here, it's a great setup. How it got to this point, I don't know. But here, this bee will only go to camas plants. Whenever it goes to camas plants, the pollen's all to itself. Every other bee is just nibbles on it and doesn't go to it. And so now it's got this pollinator that's going to be very good because every pollen grain that it picks up and drops off is always going to be, it's going to always go to camas, death camas.
It's gonna be dependent on this heat. That's the only thing they can do with pollination. That's kind of what it trades off.
It can. That's right. You've put a lot of all your eggs in this basket.
So where do you find this death chemistry? This plant?
Find it all throughout here. Yeah.
It's-
Yeah. This bee here we find often in Southern Oregon.
So this is a plant that's native to Oregon.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let me skip along. I had not, I'm going to just take us right to solitary, short life cycle.
Mostly not around, dormant, and then shows up only when this is blooming.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have a lot of bees like that. It's actually shockingly common. Okay, I want to just move on to pollen and beekeeping. I'll finish up here in 5 minutes. So it's really important. Pollen is important for your colonies. We have this really old publication from 1948. It's really wonderful. If you use that QR code, you'll find it. It's hard to find. The Nectar and Pollen Plants of Oregon by Herman Scullin and George Van Zyl. Herman Scullin, the first apiculture researcher at Oregon State University. If you open it, it's a great book. It's not out of date. It's has super great information. And if you look in it, there is this great quote that goes something like this. It says, bees consume surprisingly large amounts of pollen, more than a pound of pollen daily. Pollen traps operated cooperatively at Junction City, Corvallis, and Ashland had 21, 25, and 40 pounds collected in a year. That's how much pollen your colony needs. And of course, there are some plants, very open flower, things like meadowfoam. This is a daily catch of meadowfoam in one colony can give you, a pound in a day. And so you can trap pollen, and pollen traps, there's a number of different types that I like. The ones that go underneath, that are mounted underneath. They've got a nice system for engaging and disengaging the traps and keeping the pollen clean. But there are also these front porch traps. You have to make sure the colony is very well sealed, but you can trap out the pollen. Different plants differ on how much pollen is available. This is a study that I did in Corvallis, and you can see a bunch of different plants. But what I want you to take away from this is something like a California poppy has a ton of available pollen, and bees get a lot of pollen per visit off them. All the rest of the plants are in the mustard family. Plants in the mustard family kick off a lot of pollen. And so, you're next to something like this, you can generate heaps of pollen. And in fact, this is what a colleague of mine did. She works with canola, Shelley Hoover. She's at the University of Lethbridge. This is the world's largest bee in the Alberta Canadian town of Falher, honey capital of Canada. And so she trapped pollen continuously during the bloom of this canola because it was blooming for a long time. And she looked at the honey production in those colonies because when you're trapping pollen continuously, the bees make less honey. So if you look at this, the colonies that had a pollen trap through the entire bloom of mustard had about, a 5 kilogram hit in in honey production because the bees are kind of so busy collecting pollen and it takes a drag on them. But when she looked at the total revenue that they got because you can sell pollen and has value, they made more profit. So by putting the pollen trap on and getting having a cut in the amount of honey they produced, they actually came out on top. But we are after the after the pollen flow. We're in this terrible time of year. It's nice to be in Portland because everybody's planting these beautiful plants that have evolved over millions of years in their gardens that are blooming right now. But as Herman Scullin pointed out in his book, after July, we have a problem. There's not a lot of pollen available. And the consequence of this is in this beautiful, I'm going fast now, but this beautiful study from 1936, if you look at the fall pollen reserves in your colony and the spring bee population, it tracks really well. If your colonies go into winter with a lot of pollen, they will have a big brood. They will bounce up and grow through the winter. They need it for the production of these winter bees. So it's really important to have this pollen flow late in the year. And let me just conclude with this. If you're interested, this is my pitch to you tonight. We do have a smartphone app way of documenting bees on flowers. It's in the iPhone, the smartphone app called iNaturalist. Really easy. All you do is you go to your wherever and you choose iNaturalist Classic. There's two in the store, iNaturalist and iNaturalist Classic. Choose iNaturalist Classic. Load that on your phone. And then what you're going to do is you're going to join this project, the Nectar and Pollen Plants of North. I'll show you how to do this in a second. So what you're going to do is you're going to take a picture of any plant that you come across, and you're going to notice how many bees are foraging on the plant. You're going to kind of like look at it for a minute and say, I think there's about 10 bees foraging, roughly. And you're going to tell us the color of the pollen. We've had 1,300 observations so far. Nope, Android too.
Some only see iNaturalist.
Oh, maybe it's on Android. They have only one kind of iNaturalist. Perfect. Thank God. That new one is like new Coke. Okay. What you do is you have a dashboard like this. You take a picture. Then you go to the projects. You'll join this project, Nectar and Pollen Plants of North America. And then you have a dashboard like this. Takes a second to do. Yeah. Okay. You're totally good. So on this, you look at it and you say, how many bees did you see? And we've changed this to a minute period, and it's roughly a minute period. Are you seeing no honeybees, or is it just this got a lot of honeybees on it? So you just select this. I see a lot of honeybees on it. I don't see very many honeybees on it. Then you ask the question, look at all the bees that you see. Are any of them carrying pollen? And it's like, no, they're not. It's on lavender. There's no pollen carrying. Then you say no. And even if you see a plant that doesn't have, it should have bees on it, but you don't see bees on it, take a picture. And then you have an option for what does the pollen color look like. Some of you noticed at the back of the room, I was quickly pulling this together because I did want to show you. Here's what we have so far. If you look at the plants with very high visitation in orange, dark orange, medium visitation, medium orange, low visitation blue, or gray, no honeybees, you can see we can now generate a list. This is for Oregon with Photonia, oregano, cotoneaster.
Wow.
Oregano. Oregano is great, as you all know. Oregano is a great bee plant.
Huh.
In the mint family, when I tell you, all the way down. I also noticed that a lot of the plants that we had, like there's a whole bunch of plants we just didn't see very many bees on. And so we got a small number of plants that really are driving visitation. If you do this, we'll get a huge database. It'll be great. We'll be happy. And that's it. Thank you, everybody. Charlie, how many, one or two questions?
Sure, as many questions as we have.
Okay. All right, Charlie.
You didn't say anything about amino acid.
Yeah, that's right. So the pollen do vary in terms of their amino acid composition, the different fats that they contain. There's variability in them. I personally am not a big proponent of the pollen quality idea. I have a reason for this. You have beavers, right? Go beavs. They have evolved to eat cellulose, and that's all they live on. Their entire life cycle is on that. I think there's bees that are evolved on pollen that isn't actually that nutritious, and they just evolved mechanisms to digest it. And so sometimes I think with us, we're thinking about honeybees. Here's another example, lupins. We've talked about this, bumblebees on lupins. Lupins provide toxic pollen to bumblebees. Has very little impact because it's always mixed at some level. So sometimes I think, okay, we're like, we want to optimize one bee plant to rule them all. And maybe for honeybees, there will be one with the highest amino acid content. But when we ask the question of like highest numbers, I'm not sure we ever ask the question of how much of it is incorporated into the bee, how much of it is being utilized. And so I think there's this kind of race to like, we need these optimal plants, but it may in the end not matter because the bee has mechanisms for digesting, for incorporating, for utilizing, for making up for nutrients that are low in components. The one example that I can speak on this with any authority, because I've discredited myself perhaps, are the Asteraceae. This time of year, most of the things we have in our garden, the goldenrod, the coneflower, the black-eyed Susans, the purple American asters,
Bee balm, aster.
bee balm, they're all in that group. And there was work early on that showed that whatever honeybees could, and it's an old study, gets quoted a lot, dandelions are missing a key amino acid. And so that honeybees have to, if you lock them in with the dandelion, which is in the Asteraceae, they would have a problem because they needed they got to make up for a missing amino acid. But in the wild, I don't know if it matters. When dandelions are out, my colonies look good. And so it's possible that how much of just a little bit of clover pollen is needed to make up for the deficit. That I don't know.
And Andony, question from on Zoom.
Oh no, it's Glenn. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. So you've talked a lot about the color and the protein and all that kind of stuff, content of pollen. What about shape and stickiness? Because I would think it would be greatly to a flower's advantage if the bee can release it or deposit it on other flowers.
Yeah, that's a good question. Glenn, I know you know your plants. Do you have an example that you could share with us that you think this happens around?
I was thinking perhaps of California poppy. I mean, they seem to collect a lot. I see a lot of my bees coming in with the pollen, so I'm just wondering how much of it gets released on other flowers.
Yeah. This is often a criticism of the mason bee people who say that mason bees collect their pollen dry, and so they drop a lot of it. And honeybees, they just, as soon as they stick it down in a corbicula, it's unavailable. But I don't know. It's a good question, Glenn. And certainly some pollens are incredibly sticky, and some of them are very dusty, as you can see in a pollen trap. And I don't know if that has to do with just the amount of nectar they're adding to the load.
Okay, but you don't know of any specific like studies that have looked at the actual like stickiness of the pollen and particularly with honeybees, how much they release.
I don't know, and I will look into that actually. That's a fascinating idea. I'm sure somebody's done something like this. Dewey might know.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Glenn. Thanks. That's a great question. Go ahead.
I was just wondering about, I put out buckwheat beans,
Yeah,
and I noticed that they visit in the morning, they don't in the afternoon.
yeah.
Is that because of nectar or pollen?
Nectar.
It's the nectar.
Yeah, they turn off in the afternoons. And that's something I don't have a good handle of, and I've often wondered, because I think with my senses, lavender just keeps pumping out nectar. I don't think the flower, it goes until the flower is dry. Like it seems to really replenish, but some plants, there's a bit of nectar and that's all, and then it's done. And I think this is the deceptive part, maybe this study will help with. Just because a flower is in bloom and there's no bees going to it, it might be that its nectar has turned off. The nectar was produced and the flower still looks fresh. And so some of these patterns, unless you're watching the plant over time, it can be hard to know what's going on.
Lavender is time of day dependent, whether it's bumblebees or honeybees. The bumblebees are out there way earlier.
Way
than
earlier?
honeybees, and then later in the day, the bumblebees aren't gone.
I would have thought it would have been the other way. That's what you see.
Yes.
Okay.
And also I had heard that certain flowers take a period of time to produce that nectar once it's been taken.
Some plants will produce the pollen first and the nectar last. So there's all sorts of strategies that are going on. The little pulse of nectar, time of day of the nectar. So it's not, just because the flower's open and there's no visitation may not be because the bees don't go to it. It might be it's not at the phase that it's choosing to be attractive, because the plant there is a kind of like baked in strategy to nectar and pollen release.
Strategy, whether or not the nectar, I'm thinking it was just a physiological thing, that the plant can only produce nectar at a rate that's going to, once they take all the nectar, it takes the period of time different for each flower to
It may be.
that nectar.
Dewey might have a different answer to this. There's certain species of plants that just seem to exude nectar, like without a bee seems to visit it, and then there's another bee there and they still have long visits. I think there is some truth to that. It takes a while for the plant to replenish, but I think there's some plants that just put out a little bit and that's it. And there's some plants that are very quick at replacement. Yeah. Dewey, what do you think?
Yeah, there is a replenishment pattern for the walls. My question though was, so to get to the inside of that pollen grain, what is the secret that the bees have to break the exine?
Yeah, I don't. And the other thing to point out is that not all bees break it down really well. There's very few histological studies where they go to the hindgut and look at what comes out. But the ones that I have seen, there's some bees that leave a lot left over. And there's some bees that squeeze it tight and get every last bit out of it. But we know that it's mostly like the digestion of the pollen kit happens higher up in the process. I've got a nice staining study I'd love to show you, but it's at the very end of the hindgut when it's the middle part it comes out. Is it acid? Is it some kind of, I don't know. Do you know?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm thinking it's gotta be nasty.
I can't remember.
My sense is that if you look at these sectionings, like the intine is all there. I think it's kind of osmotic, like it's coming out the pores. Like on every pollen grain, there is a hole for the pollen tube to kind of come out, and it's somehow triggering that part. It'd be worth looking into. I think it'd be a great story because I think it's not really well understood, and it's clearly, otherwise every insect would be eating the pollen. Like there was something that they've clearly developed that I don't quite understand.
So, pollen, does that carry the DNA of the plant? What exactly?
The male part,
Okay.
yeah, it has a tube in it. So there's a tube that comes out of that little pore, and it hits the pollen, the stigma. It germinates. It's like a seed. It actually, and it extends. It just like remember that rubber man in the old days? It kind of like it extends all the way down to the ovule where the ovary is, and then it releases the genetic material, moves all the way down, and then it fuses, and then you get a seed, and then you get an apple from that, or a blueberry, or a pod. Yeah.
And it can go all the way down, or yes.
Isn't that something? Like it's not like the cell is multiplying. It's not like you have cell, it's like the one cell is stretching all the way down the corn tassel to get to the ovule. It's crazy.
That's the one that always astonishes
Yeah.
me to think of. I just had a comment, you keep mentioning the mint family, if anybody doesn't know how to identify a mint, feel the stem, it's square. And it's the weirdest thing when you realize that mints have square stems.
They all have square
And you'll be
stems.
going, is that a mint? It's their stem, and it seems so weird to me, we all think of stems as round.
Yeah.
But mints are square stems.
Crazy.
And it's fun to discover how many things are mints.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Welcome. Thanks, everybody online. Thanks for the question, Glenn. Let's talk more. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Thanks so much, Anthony.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. Take care.
Yep.
Oh, what's that? All right. See everybody. I miss y'all. Take care.